I'm sure you've heard the phrase the writing process before. I know you have because my son, who's just finished third grade, has been exposed to it already. So in high school, in college, somewhere along the line, you've been introduced to this idea that when you're producing any sort of document, you work through kind of a series of steps. What this chapter 6, which you've read, and I want to encourage you again, or remind you again, you have to read the chapter. I'm not going to go over the chapter in great depth, but what chapter 6 focuses on is the technical writing process. I'm going to preface this by saying that Lannon tends to try to draw kind of a distinction between the technical writing process and the standard writing process. I would say that really the technical writing process is the standard writing process. The only difference is perhaps some of the elements of the writing process have a certain urgency or a greater weight about them when you're producing a document in the workplace. So this is kind of a quick overview of some of what Lannon sees as distinctions or differences between the tech writing process and the standard writing process. First of all, the writing process, as outlined on this slide, is kind of oversimplified, sorry, especially the very beginning of it. Landon here describes the writing process as researching, planning, drafting, and revising. I prefer to describe it as pre-writing, writing, and revising, and that's because pre-writing can involve all kinds of things, generating ideas through brainstorming techniques. It can also involve analyzing the writing situation if you've been assigned a task in the workplace, figuring out what it is your boss really wants you to do, figuring out how best to do it for the audience, the situation in which you find yourself. So just keep that in mind that before you start writing, there's a lot of stuff that typically happens. Some of it just happens automatically. Some of it doesn't have to be planned out. Some of it you just will run through in your mind. But the goal of breaking it down and analyzing it as a process is just to be sure that you have carefully considered the document, prepared the document as best you can, and then carefully reviewed the document before it goes out. Sometimes the things that we do automatically, we kind of rush through, we don't do well, or we don't understand how we do them, so we're not as efficient and effective as we could be. So let me just hit some of these differences and identify why they're not completely differences. First of all, Lannon points out that research often will involve discussions with technical experts. The reason he draws this distinction is that in the workplace you may be called upon to incorporate information in a document that falls outside your area of expertise. So if you're preparing a sales proposal, for example, and you are a marketing person and you're describing a technology developed by engineers, you need to understand that technology well enough to know what to emphasize about it to sell it, and also what not to say about it, because you don't want to be misleading in your marketing and sales materials. So that's a case where you're really going to have to find those experts and tap into that expertise to make sure that your document, when you think in terms of the technical level of your audience, that the document would be appropriate for those of that highest technical level, even if you're not an expert. Audience analysis is always important in academic writing as much as any other kind of writing. In academic writing, oftentimes the audience is your instructor, which is not an unimportant audience. Your instructor is going to be assigning a grade, so in addition to meeting the parameters of the assignment, it is very, very important to understand what his or her preferences might be in terms of subject matter, in terms of organization, in terms of style. All of these things can have an impact on that grade if you think about them very carefully. Of course, in the workplace, it's crucial. Your workplace document is only being prepared to communicate, with communication including not just getting something across, making yourself understood, but also having that document have the impact you want it to have. In other words, if you want to persuade, your audience will be persuaded. If you want them to take action, your audience will take action with a proper level of internalization and motivation, which we talked about last week. Oftentimes in the workplace, there are group dynamics and interpersonal dynamics that will play into that audience analysis that are often usually more complex than you're going to find in an academic setting. And in fact, in an academic setting, these typically aren't considered unless your instructors included them as part of an assignment. So in terms of hierarchy within an organization, in terms of what groups get along with what groups, or sensitivity towards certain subjects or concerns in the workplace, these all can have an impact on how you communicate. And that is fairly distinctive. That is pretty much something that will happen only when you're writing in a professional environment. Oftentimes, technical works or business works, writing done in the workplace is done collaboratively. So this is a key distinction. You need to make sure you build in the group development and the group dynamic into the planning, writing, and revising process. And that is somewhat different from just sitting down at your computer and writing something yourself. Workplace documents are oftentimes really carefully reviewed before they go out, especially if they might have legal safety ramifications, if they're going out to an external customer or something like that. The company has to make sure, because the company is responsible for it. It's not just your document. Because you produce that document as an employee of that company, the company is responsible for it. And so therefore it's going to, if the resources are there, go through a pretty rigorous checking before it's made available to its audience, internally or externally, but especially externally. The proper format is essential. This is true in academic writing too, but academic writing, that proper format is typically going to be MLA format or APA format. So they're fairly straightforward. In the workplace, you have to think about the genre. In other words, is this a letter, a memo, a brochure, a report, an email, a web page? You also then have to think about how that genre is implemented in that specific workplace. So certain types of reports will be very, very rigid and fixed in a workplace. If you have to produce a safety report about your area once a month or once a week or something like that, chances are you won't just go to Lannan and find out what a report looks like. Chances are you're going to have a very specific format that is in place for your workplace that you'll have to follow for that. So knowing what in general terms the document has to look like, and then making sure you understand specifically for that workplace, is really essential. You have to understand in the workplace a lot of messages will go out digitally and sometimes physically and digitally. In other words, something may go out as an attachment to an email and then also be made available for filing physically as a compiled printed document. So a tech report, for example. So you just want to be conscious again to take full advantage of what an electronic document can do, while still making sure the document is formatted appropriately and works as a printed document. Or if it's purely digital, being conscious of how it's being put out there and understanding the conventions of, for example, what a web page should look like, what are the best practices for creating content for a web page, and then applying those and implementing them. Deadlines can be incredibly intensive in the workplace. The only place you will sometimes feel that pinch in academia is written exams. You may sometimes have 1 hour to sit and prepare a document responding to a question as part of a final exam or as a final exam in an academic setting. In the workplace, you may be told to produce a memo, an email, or even a quick report very, very quickly. You may be told to send an email out within 10 minutes. And if the email is just a simple informational email, even that takes some consideration because you want to make sure you provide the information needed as clearly as possible. This is the pyramid that Lannan uses to outline the technical writing process. I'm going to say something about the dangers of it being a pyramid in a second, but let me just go through this very quickly. He begins the foundation of the document, the beginning of the process, the base of the pyramid is developing both the ideas that are going to formulate the document and then developing the content of the document itself. So this really entails gathering information, but also generating information through brainstorming. It will also entail, as part of that gathering, really understanding the writing situation. So this is where you would think very carefully about your audience, think very carefully about what you're trying to accomplish. All this sort of stuff at this sort of foundational level is important because as you move into the planning stages, you want to be able to think pretty specifically, have gathered information about your audience, For example, when you crafted your cover letters and resumes, in this first stage is where you would be finding an advertisement, finding out about the company, maybe doing some digging about that profession to see what general needs there might be in that profession. The planning stage then is where you'd start pulling that all together into deciding what your document should look like. So this is where you will decide how to address your audience, decide, really narrow down and focus your purpose, decide on the organization, outline, put all the bits and pieces together that you need to really sit down and write a solid draft. Then you'll write. After writing, someone should look at it, and here you'll have your classmates look at it. And then I will give you feedback as well when I assess, and then you'll have an opportunity to revise documents after that. So you will have them reviewed, and then you will, in the fourth stage, you yourself evaluate not only the document but the feedback you've gotten on the document, pull it all together, decide how best to make this thing work. Now, one key with this fourth stage is, notice it's evaluate and revise, it's not proofread. Proofread is going to be sort of the very, very last thing you do before the document goes out. The revision stage is actually about seeing things differently. Revision, it means to see again. Vis is the Latin root for seeing. Re means again. So you're trying to see it afresh. You're trying to see it again. And then you produce a finished document. It's this finished document that gets proofread. This is where you go through and try to make sure the commas are where the commas should be and the periods are where the period should be, and all of that. I'm going to really go over these questions to consider that Lannan includes really quickly, because these are in your text. I want you to read them in your text. They are useful. What they do is they just reinforce some of what I've said about the writing process so far. So in terms of ideas and information in your document, this is what you produce in that very first stage. What these questions remind you of is the writing process is not a kind of a lockstep. I've done this, now I'm done with it. I've done this, now I'm done with it. It's recursive. What does that mean? It means you go back and forth. So you'll go all the way back to the beginning after you finish a document, or while you're writing the document. You'll sometimes discover, wait a second, I'm drafting, but I at this point where I know I need more information to get this part right. So you might set aside your draft and then go do some more research. Well, these are the sorts of questions you would ask at the end of having produced the document. These questions will send you back to that first stage potentially, and that's perfectly normal. That's how the writing process works. So making sure you've got the issue defined accurately, make sure you've got the right information. It's accurate, complete, reliable, verifiable. We're going to go into how you do all of this sort of stuff as we start diving into your tech report in a little while. Have you addressed a balance of viewpoints? Do you understand the information you've gathered together, and have you imparted that clearly to your reader? And then always be sure you've identified recommendations if you're going to make them, and make sure those recommendations have been well supported. Identify risks and benefits, because those will not just be something you tag into your conclusion, but potentially things that will change the way the document looks. If you, after writing this report, come across a really important benefit of what you're proposing that hadn't occurred to you before, that could reshape the entire report. As you plan the document in advance, questions to consider. Most importantly, what do you want that document to accomplish, and who's your audience? That's where that audience and use profile that we've been working with comes in so handy, because you have to think about these things very carefully. Who specifically is your primary audience? Who else might read this, and what are they going to do with it? And all of these other questions really get at those two things. So political realities is helping you understand who your audience is, right? What do they need to know? That's a combination of who's my audience and what are they going to do with this document. Consider organization, format, and visuals. All these sorts of things should really be part of the planning stage, not something you sort out after the fact. Okay. And then again, as you wrap up this organizing process, you need to make sure that you've not left anything out. It's also at this stage that you're going to think about the conclusion and the introduction very carefully. Now that I've got an idea of what exactly I'm going to say, how's the best way to introduce this, and what's the best way to sum it up for readers? Finally, the evaluation revision stage. And again, Lannan includes checklists, which are really great, and these are incorporated into a checklist in Lannan. But really just to make sure, as you review, these questions all get down to what? Is this document doing what I need it to do for the audience? So is it useful? Does the organization make sense? In other words, if when my audience picks this up, are they going to get the maximum benefit from it? Because by being able to negotiate it, know where stuff is and find where things are, and understand the flow of your thoughts easily. The last thing I want to really highlight, and again, I warned you I was going to go through those very quickly. The last thing I really want to highlight is what the proofreading stage can look like. Errors in terms of mechanics can be really damaging and distracting. The grammar is not the most important thing in writing, but it is very important. And I would say especially in a workplace document. When you write an essay for an English teacher, to be honest, we are most interested usually in your ideas. And as long as your grammar is not really awful, we'll highlight grammatical issues. You're going to lose points for them, but we're not going to judge you differently if your ideas are good, because we're so used to seeing students struggle with grammar. It's not like that in the workplace. If you put out a memo that's 3 lines and it's got 4 spelling errors in it, or it's got a messed up comma use or messed up, it's going to stand out. And the message it sends, when you read a document that is chock full of errors, it seems to say something about the intelligence and ability of the person writing it. And it doesn't necessarily. Good grammar is not a sign of great intelligence. It's a sign of understanding the rules of grammar, and that's pretty much all it is. But it's sort of like if you walk into a job interview wearing scruffy jeans and an AC/DC t-shirt, you're sending a specific message about yourself, even if you've got an IQ of 800, which I don't think is possible, but even if you have an IQ of 800, even if you're the best at whatever job you're doing, if you walk in looking that way, you're going to be judged. Okay, unless you're walking into Google. I don't know, maybe you can go to some organizations and that's how they want you to look. But for the most part, people are going to judge you by how they see you. So the grammar and punctuation, in a way, that's putting on your professional business attire before going to the interview. So sentence errors, punctuation errors, usage errors, mechanics, problems with mechanics, formatting stuff, and then typographical errors. One of the things to be especially aware of is the threshold for tolerance of spelling mistakes, especially formatting mistakes. That's come down a lot with the advent of word processing. We don't expect to see spelling errors anymore. The only kind of spelling errors that I might expect to see sometimes would be those in which a word is misspelled in a way, for example, that it spells another word, in which case Word won't pick it up as a spelling error. Word isn't smart enough to look at the context of the sentence and tell whether you've used, for example, there, T-H-E-R-E, instead of there, T-H-E-I-R. Okay? And that's why you taking the time to personally proofread your document and having someone else look at it is especially important. One quick proofreading tip, and then I'm going to, well, 2 quick, I guess, proofreading tips, and I'm going to wrap this presentation up. First of all, read your document out loud, and be sure as you read it to follow the punctuation very carefully. This is a great way of identifying problems with commas and periods, because if you're reading it out loud and you stop at a period, but you're actually not at the end of the sentence, it's going to sound funny to you oftentimes. Okay? One tip for catching spelling errors is to actually read your document backwards, because a lot of times as you're reading forwards, you get caught up in the flow of what you're saying, and you can kind of slide over the types of errors that you pick up if you're really going slowly, bit by bit, through the document. Most importantly is set the thing down for a while if you can, and come back to it. And for a while really is as long as you can afford. So if you can put it aside for a week, put it aside for a week and then go back to it. If you can put it aside for a day, put it aside for a day. If you can just get up and go grab a cup of coffee, then come back and take a quick look at it, do that, because it really does help you. When you read it, then you're not reading it filling in the blanks of what you wanted to say and what you meant to say. You're reading it as it's written once you put some distance between yourself and it. Again, read that chapter carefully. There's tremendously these things is packed full of tremendously good advice. And so look through the chapter carefully again. If you've read already after this presentation, go back and revisit it.